In the forgotten shadows of history lies a truth we were never taught. The rise of a desert superpower was not an accident, nor a miracle floating in isolation. It happened in a moment when the great empires of the North were collapsing under cold skies, failed harvests, and a plague that emptied cities, while the barren sands of Arabia quietly became the only stable road left on Earth. This is the story of how climate, fate, and human resilience collided, and how a people from the desert stepped into a world broken by nature and rewrote the map of civilization. Welcome to the Missing Dots. So, just sitting here today looking over this massive stack of sources we've gathered, it's really a heavy thought to sit with.
Yeah, it really is. It changes your whole perspective.
Right. I mean, we've got paleoclimatology reports, biological studies on bacteria, translations of 14th century sociological texts, and epidemiology charts.
It's quite the collection of material.
It is, and I'm just so glad we are taking the time to sit down, maybe just imagine we are in a quiet courtyard somewhere and really talk through this. Because when you read traditional history, especially the accounts so many of us grew up with, the expansion of the early Islamic State in the 7th century is almost always painted as a story of, well, pure human effort.
Yes, exactly. We usually just hear about the battles, the bravery of the companions of the prophet, the brilliant tactics.
Right, the commanders and the strategies, and all of that is true, of course. But reading through these scientific and historical papers, it completely changes the scale of the picture.
It really does. You start to see that the stage was being set by forces much, much larger than armies.
Yeah. We're not just looking at men with swords anymore. We are looking at ice cores drilled out of glaciers in Greenland. We're looking at volcanic eruptions in the tropics.
And the biology of the camel and the shifting of global monsoon rains.
Exactly. It's almost overwhelming to realize how many massive earthly pieces were moving at the exact same time to allow this history to unfold the way it did. And if you're listening to this and you have ever felt like history is just a random series of events, well, these sources paint a completely different picture.
They absolutely do. But, before we really get into the physical evidence, like the climate data and the economics, I think it's so important to state right up front that looking at these physical causes doesn't strip away the spiritual meaning of this history.
I'm glad you brought that up. I know sometimes people feel a tension there.
Right. They think, well, if we say the weather caused a change, does that mean God had nothing to do with it?
Yeah, that's a very common fear.
But actually, it's the exact opposite. What we're looking at here is what Islamic theology calls Sunan Allah.
Sunan Allah.
Yes, these are the established divine patterns and physical laws of the universe. When we read through these climate reports, we aren't looking at random weather events that just happen to accidentally work out nicely for one group of people in the desert.
Right, it's not a coincidence.
Not at all. We are looking at the physical machinery of the universe working in breathtaking harmony. It is the natural world being commanded to clear a path.
Wow. That is a really beautiful way to phrase it. It's like looking at the internal gears of a clock. You see the cogs turning, but you know someone designed the movement.
Exactly.
So to really understand this movement, our sources tell us we have to go back to before the Islamic expansion even started. We have to go back to a very specific, terrifying moment in the 6th century. The year is 536.
Yes, 536.
I was reading through the paleoclimatology papers we have here.
Yeah.
And the scientists describe this year as basically the beginning of one of the absolute worst periods to be alive in human history.
And that is not an exaggeration. Modern science has mapped out this specific time period with a level of precision that, honestly, historians 50 years ago could only dream of.
Really? How so?
Well, the researchers literally went to Greenland and Antarctica, and they drilled deep into the ice.
I always find that fascinating. But how does an ice core actually tell us what the sky looked like in the year 536?
It's brilliant, really. As snow falls year after year, century after century, it traps whatever's in the atmosphere at that exact moment.
Oh, like a time capsule.
Exactly like that. It compresses into ice, creating these distinct layers that scientists can read almost like a barcode. And when they got down to the layer corresponding to the year 536, they found massive spikes of sulfate.
Sulfate, meaning volcanic ash and gas.
Right. And it wasn't just one isolated finding in the ice. They cross-referenced this with tree rings.
Okay, tree rings.
Yeah, they looked at ancient oak trees in Europe and bristlecone pines in other parts of the world. Trees grow a new ring every year, and the width of the ring tells you how warm and sunny that year was.
So a wide ring means a good sunny year.
Exactly. And in the year 536, the rings suddenly become incredibly narrow, and they stay narrow for years.
Wow.
What this data tells us is that there was a series of massive volcanic eruptions first in 536, then another massive one in 540, and yet another in 547.
3 massive eruptions in little over a decade. Where were these volcanoes?
Well, the evidence points to the tropics, possibly Central America or Indonesia,
Yeah.
and another one further north, maybe up in Iceland. But honestly, the location almost matters less than the volume.
Because of how much ash they pumped out?
Right. These eruptions threw millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. Once it gets up there, it spreads out across the hemisphere and creates a global veil. It literally blocked the sun.
In the stack of historical texts we have, there's a quote from an ancient historian named Procopius. He was living in the Byzantine Empire right when this happened.
Oh yes, his account is chilling.
He wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and that it seemed to be constantly in eclipse.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It really does. Imagine walking outside at noon and it just looks like twilight. And the temperature drop was severe, wasn't it?
Very severe. We're talking about an average temperature drop in the northern hemisphere of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius.
That might not sound like a huge number when we look at our daily weather apps.
Right. But as a global average, it is catastrophic.
Yeah.
It triggered a climate anomaly that climatologists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age.
The late antique little ice age.
Yeah. And this period of intense cooling lasted for over a century,
Yeah.
roughly from 536 all the way to around 660.
Okay, so the sky goes dark, the temperature drops. I want to really try and understand what that actually means for the average person living through it.
It means pure survival mode.
Right. And especially for the big superpowers of the time. If I'm the emperor of Rome in Constantinople, or the king of Persia, and my realm gets a few degrees colder, well, couldn't these massive, wealthy empires just weather the storm?
You would think so.
I mean, it's like someone secretly unplugged the refrigerator of the ancient world. You lose a few crops, sure. But these were the 2 most powerful, sophisticated empires on Earth. They had roads, they had granaries, they had gold. Why would a cold snap ruin them?
That is the most natural question to ask. But we really have to look closely at how those empires actually functioned on an economic level.
Okay.
The Byzantine and Sasanian empires were not like modern states.
Mm-hmm.
Today, if farming takes a hit, a country might rely on its tech sector or manufacturing or, financial services.
Right, we have diversified economies.
Exactly. But in late antiquity, these empires were fundamentally solar-powered agrarian fiscal states.
Solar-powered agrarian fiscal states. Unpack that for me. What do you mean by that?
It means their entire existence, their entire government budget, relied entirely on taxing agricultural output. Wealth was grain. Wealth was wheat and barley.
Not just gold coins.
No, the physical food. To maintain their massive standing armies, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers guarding thousands of miles of borders, they needed an absolutely predictable, constant supply of grain.
So they were completely 100% dependent on the weather behaving normally.
Entirely. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, relied heavily on Egypt and Syria to act as its breadbaskets. Egypt was the golden goose.
And the Sasanian Empire?
The Sasanian Empire, the Persians, they relied on the complex river and canal systems of Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq.
Oh.
When this late antique little ice age hit, the growing seasons in these critical regions were suddenly shortened by 3 to 6 weeks.
Wow. And 3 to 6 weeks doesn't sound like much until you realize that crops are basically biological clocks.
Exactly.
If the frost comes early or the spring comes late, the plant just dies in the field.
Crops need a very specific amount of warmth and sunlight to mature. Without it, the harvest fails. And because of the continuous volcanic veil, the harvest failed year after year after year.
But hold on, the Romans had granaries, right? They built massive storehouses for exactly this reason.
They did.
So why couldn't the emperor just open the emergency reserves and feed the people until the dust settled?
Well, they did, initially. But granaries only hold so much surplus. They were designed to weather one bad season, maybe 2. When you have 3, 4, 5 years of consecutive agricultural failure across the entire hemisphere, the reserves run dry. And that is when you enter a fiscal death spiral.
Walk me through that spiral, because I think we often separate economics from military history, but here they are exactly the same thing.
They were completely intertwined. Think about the mechanics of the ancient tax system. The farmer grows wheat, he keeps some to eat, and the state takes the rest as tax.
Simple enough.
Right. But no grain means no surplus. No surplus means no tax revenue. When the state cannot collect taxes from the provinces, the imperial treasury in the capital starts to empty. And when the treasury empties, the emperor cannot pay the army.
And a standing army that isn't getting paid is a very dangerous thing.
It is the end of an empire. When soldiers don't get their rations and their coin, they mutiny. Or they simply abandon their posts and go home to try and feed their own families.
So the borders become completely porous.
Exactly. And to try and stop this, the state, in its desperation to keep the military functioning, starts squeezing the peasant farmers even harder. Yes. The tax collectors go out and demand money or grain that the starving farmers simply do not have.
So the farmers either starve or they abandon their land and flee into the cities to look for handouts, which just means even less food is grown the next year. It's a terrifying cycle, subhanAllah.
It really is.
The empires were already rotting from the inside out just from the cold and the hunger.
They were incredibly vulnerable. And this is where the physical environment delivers the next blow.
Yeah.
Because cold and hunger were just the setup.
The setup for what?
The biological consequence of widespread starvation was about to arrive.
A plague.
Yes, the Justinian plague.
Right.
It officially hits the Mediterranean in the year 541. Based on the epidemiology reports we were looking at, this is the first historically documented pandemic of bubonic plague. It is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis.
I was looking at the timeline, and it is so striking. The volcanoes erupt in the late 530s and 540. The crops fail.
Yeah.
And then right when the population is at its absolute weakest, the plague arrives in 541.
Which is a perfect storm.
It's deeply connected to the climate shock, isn't it? Because people are malnourished, their immune systems are completely shot.
Precisely. You have a biologically compromised population. If you are starving, your body simply cannot fight off an infection. But what is truly fascinating and horrifying is how the plague actually traveled.
How did it spread so fast?
It is entirely tied to the imperial infrastructure we were just talking about.
Right, because bacteria can't just walk thousands of miles on its own. It needs a ride.
And the Romans provided the perfect ride. The plague bacteria lived in fleas, and those fleas lived on black rats.
Okay, rats and fleas.
The epidemiology sources map this out clearly. The plague came up through the Red Sea trade routes and hit the Egyptian port city of Pelusium. Now think back to what we just discussed about Egypt.
It was the breadbasket. It was the center of the empire's grain supply.
Right. So you have these massive warehouses in Egypt filled with grain, which naturally attract thousands and thousands of rats.
Oh, man.
The fleas infect the rats. The rats climb aboard the massive grain ships, the very ships that are mandated by the state to feed the capital.
Oh, wow. So the ships sailed directly from Egypt.
Directly into the very heart of Constantinople. The emperor's own logistical supply chain, the very thing keeping the empire alive, became the delivery mechanism for its destruction.
That is just, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the biology of the flea itself is so strange. From what I read in these disease reports, the plague bacteria actually blocks the flea's digestive tract.
Yeah, that's right.
It creates this biofilm, so the flea can't swallow any blood. The flea feels like it's starving to death, so it goes into a frenzy, biting everything it can find, trying to feed, and instead it just regurgitates the bacteria directly into the human bloodstream.
That is the exact mechanism. It's a microscopic horror story. And once it arrives in Constantinople, a city packed with malnourished people, the results were apocalyptic.
The numbers in the historical sources, you can barely comprehend them.
It's hard to grasp.
At its peak, historians living through it estimated that up to 10,000 people were dying every single day in Constantinople.
10,000 a day.
They couldn't dig graves fast enough. They actually started taking the roofs off of watchtowers, filling the towers with bodies and putting the roofs back on.
Modern demographic estimates suggest that over the course of the pandemic, which returned in waves for decades, somewhere between 25 to 50% of the population of the Mediterranean and the Near East vanished.
50%.
Yes. We are talking about millions upon millions of people.
SubhanAllah, just imagine walking through a capital city and half the people you know are gone. The tax collectors are dead, the farmers are dead, the soldiers are dead. The entire machinery of the state just grinds to a halt.
And we really must remember that the Persian Sasanian Empire suffered just as horribly.
They got hit too.
Oh, absolutely. They also had massive crowded cities and complex trade networks. At one point, the plague wiped out huge portions of the Persian royal court. Combined with the internal chaos caused by the financial collapse, the Sasanians went through 14 different rulers in just 4 years.
Wait, 14 kings in 4 years?
Yes. That is a state in total freefall. You cannot run an empire when the king changes every few months. They were politically fractured, militarily exhausted, and biologically decimated.
Now, this brings up a really vital question, and it's something you start wondering as soon as you look at the map of this plague.
What's that?
Well, if this disease was so aggressive and it was traveling along all these trade routes, jumping from city to city, why didn't it wipe out the Arabs in the desert too?
Ah,
I
yes.
mean, they were right next door. They traded with Syria in the north and Yemen in the south. They traveled to these places. So why did the Arabian Peninsula survive this biological collapse?
It's a brilliant question, and the answer lies entirely in the ecology of the desert. It comes down to what researchers call a biological firewall.
A biological firewall. How does that work?
Well, the bubonic plague thrives in a very specific environment. It needs dense, overcrowded human populations. But more importantly, it needs massive concentrated grain storage to feed the large rat populations, which carry the fleas.
Right, like the warehouses in Egypt.
Exactly. The Arabian Peninsula did not have that ecology. It was vast, arid, and sparsely populated by nomadic Bedouin tribes.
So they just didn't have the density or the giant storehouses of food to attract the rats.
Right. They did not have urban grain silos. The Bedouin lifestyle naturally involved moving constantly in small, dispersed groups.
So even if someone got sick.
If a small outbreak did somehow reach a tribe, it might affect that one camp, but it wouldn't spread across the peninsula because there simply wasn't the dense, continuous network of crowded cities to carry it.
They were naturally quarantined by the landscape.
Exactly. Because of this geographic and lifestyle isolation, the people of the Hijaz, which is the western strip of Arabia where cities like Mecca and Medina are located, they maintained a completely uncompromised immune baseline.
That is fascinating.
Their population numbers stayed steady while the empires to the north were losing half their people. The desert naturally protected them from the microscopic collapse happening just a few hundred miles away.
It really makes you pause and think. The Romans and the Persians built these massive, complex cities and intricate trade networks, and they saw all of that as the ultimate sign of their strength and civilization.
Of course they did.
But that very complexity became their graveyard. The plague used their own strength against them. Meanwhile, the harshness of the desert, which the empires probably looked down on as backwards and empty, became an absolute sanctuary.
It had a profound shift in power dynamics, driven entirely by nature. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating.
Okay.
The climate shift, that late antique Little Ice Age. It didn't just protect the Arabs from the plague. It actually changed the geography of global trade entirely in their favor. Researchers refer to this as the Hijazi exception.
Right, because while the north was freezing and starving, the weather in Arabia was doing something completely different. I was looking at the climate models for this, and it's so counterintuitive.
It is.
You would think if the world gets colder, the desert gets worse. But that isn't what happened.
No, it's a complex global system. When the northern hemisphere cooled down so drastically because of the volcanic ash, it pushed the global weather system southward.
Okay, so the weather moves south.
Specifically, the intertropical convergence zone, which dictates where the heavy monsoon rains fall, shifted slightly south.
What does that actually mean for someone living in Mecca or Yemen?
Now, we have to be careful here. Arabia did not suddenly turn into a lush, green farming utopia. That is a common misconception.
Right, it didn't become a rainforest.
It was still a harsh desert. But what happened was that the Hijaz and the southern regions got just enough increased rainfall to sustain the desert wells and the pasture lands for their animals. The underground aquifers were replenished.
So the environment stabilized. It didn't become a jungle, but it became reliable.
Exactly. It stabilized the transit roads. Now, pull back and look at the geopolitical map at this exact moment in the late 6th and early 7th centuries.
Okay, looking at the map.
The traditional Byzantine and Sasanian trade highways, the ones going through Syria, Anatolia, and Iraq, are completely ruined.
Because of the weather and the plague.
Yes, they are covered in mud and frost. The cities along them are empty from the plague, and they are crawling with bandits because the imperial armies aren't being paid to guard them anymore.
So if you're a merchant trying to move goods from India or Africa up to the Mediterranean, you can't use the old Roman or Persian roads. They are death traps.
Exactly. So what do? You bypass them. Suddenly, the inland Arabian roads, the paths running from Yemen up the Red Sea coast through the Hijaz to Syria, they become the only stable, reliable logistical highway left in the known world.
That is amazing. The rest of the world's roads are broken, so all the global traffic has to detour through the desert.
And the people who know how to navigate that desert suddenly hold the keys to the entire region's logistics.
They go from being on the periphery of the world to being the center of its trade.
And they had the perfect vehicle to control that new highway.
The camel.
Yes, the camel. Specifically, Camelus dromedarius, the single-humped Arabian camel. We really have to appreciate the biology of the camel to understand the military and economic history of this period.
I feel like we totally take camels for granted. We see them in pictures and we just think of them as funny-looking desert horses.
They're so much more than that.
But reading these biological breakdowns, they are completely different machines. They are evolutionary marvels.
They are built for an environment that kills almost everything else. Let's look at the mechanics of the camel. A thirsty camel can drink 25 gallons of water in one single sitting.
25 gallons? That's absurd.
Usually, if an animal drinks that much water that quickly, its red blood cells will literally burst due to osmotic pressure.
Because the water floods the cells.
Right. But a camel's red blood cells are oval-shaped, not round, which allows them to expand up to 240% of their original size without rupturing.
That is incredible. And once they drink, they can march for days.
Yeah, they can march for over a week carrying heavy loads without needing to drink again. Their bodies are designed to retain moisture. Their nasal passages actually cool the air they exhale and trap the water vapor, sending it back into their bodies.
Wow.
And of course, the hump is a massive store of fat, which provides energy when there is no food on the trail. They can carry 450 to 600 pounds of cargo.
Now, contrast that with the pride of the Byzantine and Sasanian armies, the heavy horse cavalry.
Yes, the cataphracts. The contrast is everything.
Right.
The Romans and Persians relied on massive men in heavy iron armor, riding massive horses. A single Byzantine war horse, operating in an arid environment, required about 40 liters of water and 10 kilos of grain every single day.
Every single day. Let's just do the math on that. If you have an army of 10,000 horses, you need 400,000 liters of water every day.
Yes.
So our Roman army couldn't just walk out across the sand. You are physically tethered to rivers, wells, and giant supply depots.
You are completely chained to your infrastructure.
Yeah.
And remember, because of the climate crisis, they don't even have the grain to feed those horses anyway.
It's like the Romans were driving these massive gas-guzzling tanks that needed a gas station every 10 miles, and the early Muslims were driving solar-powered rovers that never needed to stop.
That is a brilliant analogy. The logistical advantage was completely asymmetric. A Roman army could only operate about 50 miles away from a stable water source before they had to turn back.
But the Arabs?
An Arab force mounted on camels could operate hundreds of miles deep into the desert. They could strike a border town, gather supplies, and vanish back into the sands before the Romans could even saddle their horses or organize a pursuit.
Because if the Romans tried to follow them into the deep desert,
They would die of thirst. It is as simple as that. The desert was an impenetrable fortress for the Arabs, but an open highway for their attacks.
it's like having control over the ocean, right?
Exactly like naval superiority. And there are specific historical moments that show how devastating this biological advantage was.
Give me an example.
Look at the famous Muslim commander Khalid ibn al-Walid. In the year 634, he was fighting in Iraq, and he received orders that he needed to get his army to Syria as quickly as possible to help the Muslim forces there.
Right, but between Iraq and Syria is a massive waterless wasteland. I think it was known as the Desert of Death.
Yes. The local guides told him it was absolute suicide to take an army across it. It was considered physically impassable for a military force.
How long would it take the Romans?
The Romans would take weeks to march around it, following the Fertile Crescent up and over.
But Khalid did it anyway. He went straight across.
He did. He used a brilliant strategy. He made the camels drink to their absolute physical limit. He even bound their jaws so they couldn't graze and waste moisture.
Wow.
Then they crossed that brutal stretch of desert in just 5 days. Along the way, they slaughtered a few camels to drink the water stored in their stomachs.
It sounds so harsh, but it was pure survival.
It was unparalleled logistical discipline. And after 5 days, they emerged right behind the Byzantine defensive lines in Syria.
The Romans must have been terrified.
They were completely caught off guard. They literally could not comprehend it. It broke all their established rules of military strategy.
I mean, how do you defend your borders against an army that can just materialize out of a waterless wasteland?
You can't. You cannot track them, you cannot anticipate them, and you cannot cut off their supply lines because they carry their supply lines inside their animals.
That level of endurance, that mastery of the environment, it's hard to even fathom. But Listening to all this, the camels, the shifted rain patterns, the rugged desert lifestyle, it brings up a really critical, obvious question.
What's that?
The Arabs had camels for centuries before the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born.
Seems-
The desert was always there. The Romans and Persians were neighbors for hundreds of years. In fact, if we look at the history, there were actual Arab kingdoms right on the borders, like the Lakhmids in the east near Persia and the Ghassanids in the west near the Romans. If all it took to conquer an empire was camels, tough men, and bad weather, why didn't they do it 100 years earlier?
That is the essential question. And if we just look at the climate and biology, we miss the human element. The geography provided the physical opportunity, but it does not explain the motivation or the unity.
Okay, so what does explain it?
To understand that missing piece, we have to look at the philosophy of history, specifically the work of the great 14th century sociologist and historian Ibn Khaldun.
Ibn Khaldun. He wrote the Muqaddimah, right? I have excerpts of it right here in the stat.
Yes, the Muqaddimah is a masterpiece of sociology. Ibn Khaldun spent a lot of time analyzing why empires rise and fall, and he is famous for a specific concept called asabiya.
Asabiya. How would you translate that into English?
It is tough to translate perfectly, but it roughly means group solidarity, social cohesion, or a shared sense of purpose.
Like the glue of a society.
Exactly. It is the invisible psychological glue that holds a society together and makes individuals willing to fight, suffer, and sacrifice for one another.
So Ibn Khaldun says that different environments create different levels of this glue.
Yes. He noted that harsh, unforgiving environments like the deep desert naturally forge incredibly tough people with very high asabiya.
Makes sense. If you live in the desert, you can't survive alone.
You must rely entirely on your tribe, your brothers, your cousins. Your bonds are tight because your life depends on them every single day.
And what about the people living in the empires?
Well, Ibn Khaldun argues that sedentary city life, with its wealth, its luxury, and its protective walls, gradually degrades that social cohesion.
People get comfortable?
People become soft. They start looking out only for their individual wealth. They hire mercenaries to fight for them. They become divided and entirely dependent on the state to protect them.
Okay, so when a tough nomadic group with high asabiya clashes with a wealthy, divided, sedentary group, the nomads almost always win. So the Romans and Persians had become soft and deeply divided, while the desert Arabs were physically and socially tough. That makes sense. But it still doesn't explain why the Lakhmids or the Ghassanids didn't take over earlier. They were tough Arabs too.
True, but Ibn Khaldun also understood the limitations of asabiya when it is based purely on bloodlines and tribal bonds.
Because tribes fight each other.
Exactly. Tribal solidarity only scales so far. Eventually, tribes start competing with each other. They hold grudges. The Lakhmids and Ghassanids were tough, but they lacked independence.
They were mercenaries, right?
They were client states. They were paid mercenaries who fought proxy wars for the Romans and Persians. Their goal was to get a paycheck from the empire, not to replace it.
And if we look at the Arab tribes in the Hijaz before Islam, the period known as Jahiliyyah, or the Age of Ignorance, they were constantly fighting each other.
Constant warfare.
We read about endless blood feuds over, like, a stolen camel or an insult at a watering hole that would last for decades. They had all this toughness, all this martial skill, but they were using it to destroy themselves.
Exactly. The climate crisis created a vacuum of power in the north. The camel provided the perfect military vehicle. The harsh life provided the toughness. But the missing ingredient, the absolute necessary spark, was revelation and unity.
The message of Islam.
Yes, the belief in Tawhid, the absolute indivisible oneness of God. This message did something incredible. It provided a transcendent purpose that was higher than the tribe.
It broke down the tribal borders.
It completely dissolved those petty blood feuds and united these disparate warring groups under a single legal, spiritual, and moral framework.
Wow.
Ibn Khaldun explicitly says that when the physical toughness of the desert is combined with a true, unifying religious mission, it becomes an unstoppable force. It takes all that raw kinetic energy and focuses it into a single direction.
It's like they had all these separate lasers firing in random directions, and Islam came and focused it into a single blinding beam.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
You can compare this to the Mongols a few centuries later. The Mongols also came from a harsh environment, the steppes of Asia. They had incredible cavalry logistics with their horses, and they conquered massive amounts of territory when the empires around them were weak. But it feels different.
It is very different. The Mongols had the logistics, the toughness, and a leader who united them, Genghis Khan. But they didn't bring a lasting legal or spiritual
And
system.
they just conquer.
They brought the cavalry, but they didn't bring a library, so to speak. They had a code of law, the Yasa, but it wasn't a comprehensive blueprint for human civilization. So what happened? After a few generations, they fractured and simply assimilated into the cultures they had conquered.
Oh, like they became Muslim in the Middle East or they became Chinese in the Yuan dynasty.
Exactly. But the early Muslims didn't assimilate.
No, they brought both the unparalleled cavalry logistics and a profound civilization-building code of law, ethics, and spirituality.
They didn't just conquer a vacuum left by the plague. They brought a new world with them and built it from the ground up.
This balance we are talking about between the physical realities of the world and the spiritual transformation of the people, it is a really profound thing to think about. And it brings us back to this theological concept we mentioned earlier, Sunan Allah.
Yes, the established ways of God.
Because I think a lot of people today, even people of faith, feel a tension here. We live in a very scientific age. If we sit here and say, well, the volcanoes caused the cooling, and the cooling caused the famine, and the famine weakened the immune systems, and that caused the plague.
Right, the chain of events.
Doesn't that chain of physical events remove God from the story? Doesn't it reduce this massive historical shift to just a random accident of geography and bacteria?
That is a very modern, very secular anxiety. We have been conditioned to think that science and faith are at war. But classical Muslim scholars, people like Al-Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah, they never saw a conflict between natural science and divine will.
Really, they didn't separate the two.
In the traditional Islamic worldview, nature does not operate independently of God. Laws of physics, laws of biology, the shifting of the climate, these are the Sunan Allah, the established ways in which God manages creation.
So acknowledging the physical cause doesn't negate the divine intent.
Not at all. Acknowledging that volcanic dust blocks the sun and causes crop failure doesn't remove God from the picture. It simply shows us how God operates history.
Okay, I see.
In Islamic theology, we talk about asbab, which means secondary causes. The volcano, the flea, the camel, these are just the instruments. But God is the causer of causes.
He is the one turning the gears.
Exactly. And the Quran speaks about the rise and fall of nations very directly. There's a verse in Surah Al-Imran, verse 140, where God says, "These days we alternate among the people."
So power isn't meant to be permanent.
Power and hegemony are not permanent. God rotates them to test humanity. When an empire becomes deeply corrupt, when it becomes oppressive and arrogant, God doesn't necessarily send a miraculous bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky to destroy it.
He uses the earth itself.
He often uses the natural world that he created, the very environment the empire relies on, to dismantle it.
I am thinking right now of the story of the Marib Dam in Yemen, which is also mentioned in the Quran, in Surah Saba. It feels like a perfect parallel to what we were talking about with the Romans and Persians.
It's a perfect example. The people of Saba in southern Arabia had a prosperous, highly developed agrarian society. They had gardens, wealth, and this massive, incredible piece of engineering, the Marib Dam, which caught the rain and irrigated their land.
But the Quran tells us they became corrupt.
Yes, they became ungrateful and unjust.
And how were they destroyed?
Not by a magical spell. They were destroyed by a collapsing hydraulic infrastructure, a flood.
A flood broke the dam.
The climate shifted, heavy rains came, the dam broke, their agricultural base was completely ruined overnight, and the people were forced to scatter into the desert. The physical mechanism, a broken dam and a flood, is completely clear and scientifically understandable. But the divine purpose behind it is equally clear.
Alhamdulillah. Looking at it through that lens, it completely changes how you view the world around you.
It really does.
It changes how you look at a rainstorm or a dry spell, or even the news today about global supply chains. It teaches us that history isn't just random noise.
No, it has purpose.
When a society becomes tyrannical, when it extracts everything from the poor to feed a wealthy elite in the capital, the earth itself is commanded to close its doors to them. The sky is commanded to withhold the rain, the fields are commanded to freeze. It is deeply beautiful, but it is also terrifying.
It is. And this is why the traditional Islamic framework is the middle path of understanding history. Secular historians look at the late antique Little Ice Age and they say, see, it was just a random geographical accident. There's nothing spiritual about the rise of Islam. They just got lucky with the weather.
And on the other side,
On the other extreme, some well-meaning religious people want to ignore the weather entirely. They want to say it was pure magic, swords swinging on their own, physical reality didn't matter. The true understanding is right in the middle. God deliberately engineered the global climate and the biological reality, setting the stage perfectly to clear away the corrupted empires and make way for the final message.
It is a perfect synthesis of faith and reason. But naturally, when you present history this way, there are skeptics, people who look at this data and raise some really tough, critical questions.
Of course.
And I think if we want to be honest with our sources, we have to tackle those questions head on. For example, there is a very prominent theory among secular historians called the materialist scarcity hypothesis.
Yes, the argument that the Arabs only expanded out of Arabia because they were hungry.
Right. The claim is that these early Muslims weren't really driven by faith. The climate got weird, food became scarce in the desert, so they grabbed their swords and went north to raid the wealthy Romans and Persians just to survive.
Right.
It reduces the entire Islamic expansion to a giant, desperate raid for resources. How do we look at the historical record and know it wasn't just a smash-and-grab job?
Well, we know it wasn't just a desperate raid for food because of how the early Muslims behaved after they won.
What do you mean?
If you study the psychology of hungry raiders, they steal everything that isn't nailed down, they burn what they can't carry, and they run back to the safety of the desert. They do not set up courts of law. They do not protect local farmers.
Right, raiders don't build bureaucracies.
Exactly. If you want to dismantle the scarcity hypothesis, all you have to do is look at the policies of the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Caliph Umar is such a towering figure.
Yeah.
What specific policies did he enact when the Muslims took over these territories?
When the Muslim armies rapidly conquered the fertile lands of Iraq and Syria, the soldiers naturally expected to divide those rich agricultural lands among themselves as spoils of war.
Because that's what everyone did back then.
That is what conquerors did in the ancient world. You win, you take the land, and you make the locals your serfs. But Umar famously convened a council and forbade his soldiers from seizing private farmland.
He stopped his own victorious army from taking the land.
He did. He ordered them to leave the land in the hands of the local peasants, the non-Muslims, who actually knew how to farm it.
Wow. Why did he do that?
He reasoned that if the army became landowners, they would lose their discipline and the future generations would have nothing. Instead, he established an institution called the Diwan.
Explain the Diwan. How did it work?
The Diwan was essentially a state treasury registry. Instead of a few generals hoarding all the wealth and becoming feudal lords, the state collected a fair, moderate tax from the conquered lands.
A moderate tax.
Yes, and this tax was actually much lower than what the Byzantine and Persian empires had been squeezing out of them. Then, the state distributed stipends from the treasury fairly among the Muslim population, based on their service and needs, while officially protecting the property and religious rights of the non-Muslim locals.
That requires incredible administrative vision.
Exactly. You do not build a complex, equitable, long-term tax system and deliberately lower the burden on the peasantry if your only motivation is desperate starvation and looting. Their goal was to build a just, lasting, God-conscious society, not to steal wheat. The institutions they built proved that their intentions were ideological and spiritual, not purely material.
That makes absolute sense. The structures they left behind prove what was in their hearts. But there's another question, and honestly, it is a much heavier one.
Okay.
It goes back to the plague. We talked about how the Justinian plague dismantled the Roman and Persian empires and how we can see that as divine justice against oppressive, arrogant systems. But diseases don't only kill tyrants.
No, they did not.
The plague killed innocent people. It killed simple farmers who had nothing to do with the emperor's corruption. And later on, a few decades after the prophet passed away, during the time of Caliph Umar, another massive wave of the plague hit the region.
Yes, the plague of Amwas.
Right, the plague of Amwas in Syria. And this plague killed thousands of Muslims. It killed great heroes of Islam, like Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, who was one of the most beloved companions of the prophet, a man promised paradise.
Yes. Abu Ubaidah, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan. Many great companions died in that outbreak.
It is a really heavy thought to process. How do we understand the suffering of those who were caught in this massive global shift, especially the believers who fell ill?
It is a profound, painful question.
If the plague is a divine tool to clear away empires, why did the righteous, the very people building this new, just society, suffer and die from it?
It is a question the early Muslims asked themselves in that exact moment. When we look at how they processed it, we have to look at the prophetic wisdom they relied on.
What did the prophet say about it?
The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught that the plague operates by physical laws. Believers are not magically, biologically immune to bacteria. The physical reality of the world applies to everyone.
Right, we are all human.
But he also taught a radical reframing of what illness and death actually mean for a person of faith.
How did he reframe it?
He taught that for the believer who stays in their land during a plague, who is patient, and who knows with absolute certainty that nothing will happen to them except what God has decreed. For that person, the plague is a mercy and a martyrdom.
A martyrdom. So they are given the same spiritual rank as someone who dies on the battlefield.
Yes, death is inevitable for all of us. The biological end is a certainty.
Yeah,
But the state in which we meet God changes everything.
I see.
For Abu Ubaidah and the thousands of believers who died at Amwaz, their physical suffering was real, but it was temporary. Their patience elevated their rank in the hereafter to the absolute highest level of martyrs. In the Islamic worldview, the suffering of this world is incredibly brief compared to eternity, and God guarantees absolute perfect justice in the hereafter for every moment of pain a believer endures.
So the physical event, the fever, the illness is exactly the same for everyone, but the spiritual reality behind it is completely different depending on the heart of the person experiencing it.
Precisely. For the corrupt, exploitative empires, the plague was a structural reckoning. It was the inevitable biological consequence of their own overcrowded, greedy urban systems collapsing under their own weight. It was a punishment.
But for the believers.
But for the innocent and for the believers, it was a transition to divine mercy. The natural law takes its course in the physical world, but divine justice is absolute in the next.
You know, as we step back and look at this entire picture we have been discussing today, it is truly awe-inspiring.
It really is.
Reading through all these sources, connecting the dots, it really was not just men with swords riding out of the desert. The rise of Islam, the spread of this final message to the corners of the earth was beautifully, perfectly choreographed.
Yes, choreographed by the creator.
It involved volcanoes erupting in the tropics,
Yeah.
shifting monsoon rains over Yemen, microscopic bacteria traveling in Egyptian grain ships, the unique biology of the camel, and the spiritual transformation of the Arab heart.
All of it.
It all converged at the exact same moment to open a door that no human hand could have ever opened alone.
And if we take a moment to connect this history to the bigger picture, to our world today, it gives you a lot to reflect on.
How so?
Look at how we live right now. We rely on incredibly complex, highly fragile global supply chains. We live in massive, overcrowded urban centers. We depend entirely on predictable weather patterns to stock our grocery stores.
We are just like the Romans and Persians in that way. We think we have conquered nature.
We are exactly like them. We have built our own solar-powered agrarian empires just with more technology. And if Sunanullah, the physical laws of God, dismantled the unbreakable superpowers of late antiquity because of their arrogance, their corruption, and the reliance on a fragile system,
We have to ask ourselves a very hard question.
how resilient are we today, morally and physically, if the earth is commanded to shift again?
That is the thought that stays with you. It leaves you wondering. If a single string of volcanic eruptions could inadvertently rewrite the religious and political map of the 7th century, what invisible physical triggers are sitting under our feet right now, quietly waiting to dictate the next 1,000 years of human history?
Exactly.
Do we have the social cohesion, the moral groundedness, and the spiritual unity to survive it? Or are we just building the same hollow structures that collapsed 1,400 years ago?
It is a question every generation has to answer for themselves.
To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.